we're on Ute land.
Myself, right? Okay. So just a reminder, John, to record. So you all got that in the middle of Kari's introduction. So we are recording this. There's a few people who had held and wanted to make sure that they could catch this at some point later because they couldn't make this. So thanks for sharing the screen. I think that's Allison. Good job. Great. Awesome. We're in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move us through the first slide or two, just set up the agenda, set some of the background here. As you can see, our agenda is that I'll introduce the IDPE a bit for those who aren't familiar with it. The course in particular that we worked in with this study and the learning objectives of that particular course. And then we'll let Allison take over and actually move us back one slide. I wanted to finish on the agenda there. So then we'll go into Allison will talk about the background on kind of led to this study. And evaluate education type information that will be useful to ground this study for you all. And then Kari will come up with some research methods, tell you about how we went about the project itself and the research. And I'll come back around and talk about some findings and implications for the field. That's the agenda. Allison, thanks. If you would then move on to the next slide and I'll get started. So essentially, I think what I want to ground the study a bit is that I've been teaching here at Western Michigan University for going on, I guess we're in 6 years now. And one of the courses that we teach, which is really critical to the entire program, is this foundations of evaluation. And through the different iterations of it, I have implemented different tools in it. And one of them was a debate form where people role played different scholars in the field, read deeply about them, then developed some sort of questions, and then we had a debate. And through the iterations of that debate, I found that it was a useful tool. And I thought, and I've seen research out there on evaluated education was sort of lacking, and so I wanted to get this out there to the field to let them see this as a tool. So the program that I teach in, the interdisciplinary PhD program, has been here for, this will be the 20th year at Western Michigan University. The mission of the program is really what an interdisciplinary PhD program you might expect to do in evaluation, and that is turn out scholar practitioners, exemplary, superior critical thinkers, if you will, people who have been taking on evaluation at its core, understanding it very well, and going out in the field and contributing to the building of our discipline. So that's the core mission of the PhD in evaluation. There are lots to say about that, but I'll just move right on so we make it through the presentation. We can always come back and you can ask questions later. The Eval 6000 Foundations course is essentially what you might think by the name of it, right? This is the course that introduces students to evaluation writ large and also in more detail. What are the key theorists and scholars who have contributed to the development of the field? What are the key frameworks, the tools, the way we think about evaluation as a transdiscipline, in an interdisciplinary considerations? All of those things go into this foundations course. It's really about getting students grounded in evaluation so that they can then understand all of the approaches and put them into context within which they practice. So we give degrees from 4 different colleges in this program, from the College of Arts and Humanities, the Health and Human Services, the College of Engineering, and the College of Education. So students can practice in a number of different disciplines this evaluation itself. So that's what the foundations does, is bring them together, introduces them to the field. The learning objectives are just that, right? Is that we want them to walk away with understanding the major scholars who have contributed to the field, the major frameworks that inform evaluation as a discipline, the general logic of evaluation, that core way that we think about making judgments in evaluation. So some of these foundational things that we want them to talk about. The 2 learning objectives that were the key piece to this study are that I wanted students to have a basic understanding of a wide array of evaluation theory and practice perspectives, one. And then the secondary one related directly to this study was a clear understanding of key evaluation concepts, vocabulary, and terminology. So those are the learning objectives, the foundations course within the context of the interdisciplinary PhD program. And so hopefully I didn't steal too much of your thunder, Allison, about talking about why of the study and the what of the study. So I'm going to turn it over to you to give us that and move us in deeper into the study. So Allison, your turn.
Thank you. So yes, sorry if you can hear the swing behind me, but I'm not going to move the sleeping baby. So we were responding to a call for more research on evaluator education, and we explored, as Michael said, the use of role play debate as an in-class activity for graduate students. We were building on research by Davies and McKay and Trevison, who articulated the need for practical training opportunities and advanced evaluator education. Recognizing that evaluator education is not often studied, we wanted to build on work by Gullickson et al. And King and Ayu to systematically describe this activity with the hopes of benefiting the profession broadly. This can potentially lead to a standard curriculum or pedagogical approach to achieve learning outcomes and competency development. So the role play activity was intended to integrate theoretical teachings in the foundations course, centering theory with the goal of enhanced application in practice. We identified that the role play helps students see issues from different perspectives and develop collective understanding, as well as a sense of community, and it stimulates active learning. So this is what we learned from some of the research that we did on role play as a pedagogical technique. The activity gave students the opportunity to describe scholars' perspectives on evaluation approaches, which with the hopes of increasing confidence and achieving those two learning objectives that Michael described. So in terms of what the activity looked like, we collaboratively set evaluation criteria, decided on questions, and designed a rubric to rate each other's performance. We identified 7 questions, but ultimately included 3 for the time constraints in the course. So those were around the role of those affected by or interested in evaluation, the role of causal versus descriptive claims in evaluation, and ultimate and subsidiary purpose of evaluation. So in the context of those scholars. So we were broken into groups of 2 to 3, representing 3 areas. 1, use, and those students chose Eleanor Chalinsky. Methods, the students chose Peter Rossi, and values, where the students chose the team of Egon Guba and Ivana Lincoln. It was a 2.5-hour Zoom class. Michael got our permission to record and use the transcript for this research ahead of time. During the activity, we introduced ourselves as the scholar, and then we responded to a question, the first question. We then had time to break out and discuss each team's responses. And then we came back for an informal debate where we had challenge questions and responses, and we repeated that for each question. We also debriefed following the debate, and then Michael invited students to participate in this project, and that's how Kari and I ended up here today. So we had 2 primary research questions for this project. The first was pedagogical. So is there evidence to support use of a debate to develop knowledge of evaluation theories by graduate students in evaluation? And then the second was around learning objectives. What does increased cognitive complexity look like in graduate knowledge of evaluation scholars? And now I will turn it over to Kari for research methods.
Thanks, Allison. So since we're all participants in this experience we were studying, we approached the process of analyzing the debate transcript from somewhat of a collaborative ethnographic perspective. Autoethnography works with the fact that the researcher is also a participant and that outcomes and interpretations will be influenced by that fact. And then collaborative autoethnography is the same idea, but on a group level. So individually, we are based in 2 US states and a Canadian province. So we've been meeting over Zoom and collaborating with shared documents in Google Drive, where we keep thorough notes to document our biases, our thoughts, clarification, our processes, and our progress. As part of that process, we identified the solo taxonomy as a suitable framework for thinking about what was going on in terms of student engagement in the debate. And I'll talk more about that solo taxonomy in a minute, along with some findings. We used MaxQDA to code the transcript. After a basic cleaning and an initial read through and a discussion of how the solo taxonomy could be applied, we individually coded one segment of the transcript and then came together to share our codes and sort of negotiate consensus and refine a code book. We then went on to code the transcript one segment at a time until we had moved through the entire transcript, and we would come together after each segment to validate our coding as a group. So in the next slide, we'll see what the solo taxonomy looks like. The solo taxonomy was developed by Biggs and Collis, and we found discussion of it in two different articles by Golix and Chen and Data, as well as Clinton and Hattie, to be really helpful in our work. SOLO is an acronym for Structure of Observed Learning Outcomes, and the taxonomy identifies 5 levels of cognitive complexity that can be observed in written and oral student responses. So you can see here in this chart that the first level is called pre-structural. And in this level, the student kind of misses the point. They don't have any understanding, and they might respond with irrelevant information or, yeah, just miss the point altogether. In that second level, called unistructural, the student can understand a single aspect. So there's that one bar there in the box, and make some obvious connections. They're using terminology and reciting content, but really just paraphrasing and kind of identifying things. At that third level, with the 4 bars parallel to each other, that's multistructural. The student can deal with several aspects, but doesn't make connections across them. They're able to enumerate and describe, classify, list, combine, apply methods, and so on. But it's not till we get to that 4th level, the relationship level, that students demonstrate understanding of relationships between several aspects and how they might fit together to form a whole. So there you've got the 4 parallel bars, but then the connections between them. This understanding forms a structure that allows a student to compare, contrast, relate, apply theories, and maybe explain in terms of like cause and effect. And then the 5th level is called extended abstract. So here you see not only do we have those 4 parallel bars representing different ideas, but the connections between them, and then these new ideas being generated up above it. So here the student can generalize beyond what was given and may perceive structure from a different perspective and transfer ideas to new areas. So as a unit of analysis, we looked at a student's entire response to a question or challenge. And there were lots of conversational bits and miscellaneous comments in the transcript that we didn't code. Really, as an exploratory study, we only coded content that gave us insights into the taxonomy. So this was our coding strategy. And on this side, we can see what some examples of what we found in the transcript. In the interest of time, we didn't include full quotes in the transcript here, but we're happy to share them later and discuss further. Note that there were no instances of that first pre-structural level, as you might hope for at a PhD level course, right? You can see here also the distribution, the numbers there under each label of how many segments were coded into that solo level. So in the unistructural here, you see the main ideas there, but they don't explicate on those ideas or demonstrate any analytical thinking. In the multi-structural level, they're talking at different aspects of stakeholders and evaluators, all from Rossi's approach, but not crossing into that weaving of ideas that indicates a relational thinking. And then in the relational thinking example, you can see that they're bridging knowledge perspectives of causal claims and descriptive claims and thinking across these concepts. And then finally, in the extended abstract, they're going beyond a response to the question and moving into the deeper ideas of what it means. So I'll turn it back over to Michael here to share about what we think this all means.
Great. Thank you both for the great presentations. get us into this place. So a couple of pieces, there are a few pieces here that we think are worth takeaways, right? And the basic question around whether or not role play as a pedagogical tool provided the opportunity to see evidence of learning and to see the cognitive complexity. And so for me, as the professor in this particular situation, I think that the role play really has historically, okay, there's some history to this that I didn't mention earlier, is that when I studied evaluation with Tina Christie at Claremont Graduate University, she had a role play exercise like this in our theory course as well, right? So this was something that I had experienced 19 something years ago and felt like this would be something that I would want to incorporate into my teaching. And so when I did incorporate it, I did see this opportunity where students learn more about the theory, about the approaches, about the scholars, and was able to bring that out in the debate itself. And so I feel like we can highly recommend role play as an opportunity for teachers in evaluation to help students understand theory and history. And I think that the solo taxonomy of looking at it from a cognitive complexity perspective really helped me as a teacher, as a professor, see how that learning was challenged in that debate where, especially, Kari didn't mention this, but one of the things that we did find, we found more of those higher level cognitive complexity, more complex responses in the interactive moments after the standard set of questions. So we had a set of questions, they answered the question, and then they went off and they had a few moments as the groups, scholar groups, to discuss what they heard their fellow scholars say in response to the preset question. And then they came back into the room and had this free-for-all, if you will, open conversation debate where they could challenge one another from the position of that scholar and say, well, as Rossi, I think that, Gubin, Lincoln, you've got this particular perspective a little bit, counter to the way I would, how would you respond to this? So in that conversation piece, that cognitive complexity came out is where they were challenged to put all those things together and respond in a way that showed that they really did understand Peter Rossi's approach to evaluation, or Egon Guba and Nirvana Lincoln's approaches to evaluation, so that cognitive complexity was a really valuable tool to see the learning. So I can't recommend enough the idea of the role play and the cognitive complexity as a perspective on it. So the other three things that I have here: transparency with students. The solo taxonomy was a tool that I found then was very useful when I moved into the following courses. I did not set up my learning objectives in that course organized around the solo taxonomy. At that point, I hadn't engaged with it deeply enough to do that. But after that course, I did. And in my following courses, I found that students really appreciated it because in my syllabus, I put right, very transparent, here are my learning objectives, and here are the cognitive complexity levels that I expect to see in these learning objectives. So students found that transparency of, I'm teaching with, here are your assignments, here are the expectations of how I grade these assignments. I'm looking for this level of cognitive complexity in these assignments. So that transparency, students really appreciated. And conversely, developing my learning objectives became a very organized way of thinking about what I want students to come away with out of a course. I want a certain level of cognitive complexity, and I want it to look like this. So it helped with certainly the solo helped me with the learning building my learning objectives since I've incorporated into my teaching. Finally, Kari and Allison, as you heard in the presentation, they were both in the course. Then they got to participate in this research. So this collaborative autoethnographic approach was, they both articulated this in many of our conversations, how supportive they felt that this was for emerging researchers to participate in something so deeply that they could own so closely. So that was another great benefit of this project that is worth mentioning. So that's what I wanted to mention here. I think the only thing we have left is our question slide. But I also want to leave it open for Allison and Kari in case I missed something in any of those pieces before we move into the Q&A. The crickets of no. So
I think you hit on everything from my perspective. Yeah.
all right, great. So what do we have for anybody questions from the field? I didn't see any come up in the chat, but we're open for questions and we've got some time here yet before the top of the hour.
I have a question.
Yep.
Michael, I'm Mrs. Lori here in the room. How does the solo taxonomy relate to Bloom's taxonomy, and why did you pick solo over Bloom's?
Yeah, Kari, will you take that one because you wrote a good part of that in the paper. For everybody else, this is also a paper under review right now. We've just submitted it a few days ago, so it is under review. Kari, you want to speak to that, Bloom's? But you have to unmute yourself first.
Yeah, give me just a second here. I'm thinking of the article that we just wrote. Bloom's taxonomy kind of gets at more the cognitive level of the student, and the solo taxonomy is more observing their responses. And I'm not explaining that really well, but let me see if I can pull up the article if we want to, because it's been a while since I wrote about that. I apologize.
One thing that struck me for coding purposes, 4 categories seems more straightforward than whatever Bloom's has 7.
7, right? 4 or 5. There's
more
5,
manageable.
5 in the solo, and really it's the base level is like they just don't get it, and then you move up. And you saw on the slide that there's a piece of there that gets at, you know, Hattie and Clinton and Hattie have written about this a little bit and talked about it, that the early stage of pre-structural, unistructural, multistructural are really almost quantitative in nature. It's like, are they getting it to a certain degree? Can we count it? Like, they get multiple concepts, and great, they get multiple concepts. It's when they move into that relational, you start seeing the deeper cognitive complexity. It becomes more qualitative. So they actually kind of separate.
Yeah, and I think I just lost your sound. I didn't realize you were still speaking, Michael. I'm sorry. I could see you using your hands, but I couldn't hear.
Yeah. Oh, that's too bad. Yeah, you do want to say something more? I mean, Bloom's really does get at some of those levels of effort by the student, but it's not so much as, and the cognitive complexity from my perspective was more about observed. Like the solo taxonomy allows you to observe this, where Bloom's is a little bit more behind. It doesn't lead automatically to evidence train, which the solo kind of goes you from the evidence train in. Like, I want to look at cognitive complexity. I want to have examples of the cognitive complexity, which is a little different. There was something about it, affective and cognitive also, I think, is what we had written about on the difference between Bloom and the adapted Bloom, the Rothwell's adaptation, Rothwell and Anderson.
Which has evaluation at the
It has evaluation at the pinnacle. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what we also compared it, as Michael said, to Rothwell and also Webb's depth of knowledge. And the 4 of them all, you know, have very similar roots, but the solo taxonomy really was about observing and classifying responses rather than evaluating the student individually, which I know one leads to the other. But yeah, we just felt it was a good fit, especially in the higher education setting.
All right, I'll keep going. Oh, go ahead.
Ben?
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just I was sort of sitting here listening to this and thinking about like the next step in this research almost seems like it would be to then look at associating, well, what makes the leap for the student between these taxonomy levels? So if you're trying to plan how to teach someone this material and how to sort of progress them up in their understanding, like what what are the elements, the ways of interacting with the material, or maybe even just sort of like the position on through a semester or through a course or through a degree even, that they sort of get into this like deeper level of understanding.
Mhm. I think it's so you're right. I think the next thing is, okay, certainly I would say using the solo taxonomy to inform thinking about learning and looking at the cognitive complexity that goes on in there informs how you think about their learning. And I would say that what we saw in the debate, and what I mentioned, I hinted at in my part of the presentation, where when they were challenged, you could see that higher level. And so it kind of goes, which can be problematic from an equity perspective. Not everybody thinks on their feet that well. We did see that, but we also left it quite open in the response period. You know, that it was a 10-minute open conversation time where people could quiz each other and move across theorists. So it was nice and open. They had room for those who weren't quick thinkers. Nobody cut them off with a buzzer and said, oh, you know. So there's that. But I think that what I'm trying to say to you, Brad, is that there should be ways to develop the application, the kind of interaction with the knowledge. It's, you know, testing is one way of just remote learning. And I think you can see some of that if you look at Bloom's. But when you think about challenging them to, can they put it together in a new context, in a new situation? That's where we want to get them to, because that's what we do in the field. And this debate at least moves them along that. So I would say building in more opportunities to get the learning in, but then to challenge them to bring it out. And bringing it out is where I think the biggest learning takes place.
I think also, Brad, being explicit about the taxonomy and the concepts around cognitive complexity is a really helpful way to bring students there, right? So if I know as a student, Michael spoke about transparency, and so having used the taxonomy in future courses in the learning objectives, I know what I'm trying to achieve as a student in terms of cognitive complexity on a given assignment. And I think that's a really helpful way to make it explicit and to help students see what the expectations are.
Yeah, I might add that, you know, we applied the solo taxonomy retrospectively towards this, but as Michael, towards the debate article. But as Michael mentioned, he has since started incorporating it into his syllabi at the beginning of the semester, in each assignment, saying, okay, this is kind of what I'm hoping to see. And then I've noticed even myself in other classes, this sort of metacognitive process. Frankly, as I'm writing a literature review right now, I'm like, what level am I working at here? Am I really, you know, thinking outside beyond the question? As a PhD student should. So I think that transparency and understanding where your instructor is coming from and where you want to push yourself as students, it gets us there.
Yeah, I'll say as a side note, gosh, the challenging aspect reminds me of many years ago, Michael Scriven and his classroom style, though I think it was never, you know, the expectations and things were never stated. So the idea of this being more formalized, like you said, allowing more time is helpful to include more folks sort of in that learning process in a maybe a fair way of doing so. But
I think it's more of the transparency, as I think Kari or Allison just mentioned, has really been useful in subsequent classes. When I go over the syllabus in the beginning of my class, I say, here's the learning objectives, here are the assignments, and here in the assignments is what I'm looking for. I'm looking for this learning objective, and I'm expecting you to be able to put these together conceptually. I even introduced the solo taxonomy in the opening class. Look, here are the levels of cognitive complexity that I built these learning objectives around. So the transparency has been, certainly Kari and Allison have mentioned, but other students in the classes have mentioned how useful that is with them thinking about their learning. Yeah.
Are there any questions from folks online? You can feel free to come off mute. I have another question then. In the dialogue, the debate or the free-flowing dialogue that followed, was the exchange about this is what I like. Was it contained to the idea of these scholars, or was there like, well, in this, was there any like sort of hypothetical application of the ideas that they could kick around?
No, mostly what happened was that the scholar role players got to pull on the threads of the comments, the responses to the pre-designed questions. So the pre-designed questions, like the purpose of evaluation. So each of them got to speak about their own scholar's perspective on the purpose of evaluation. And then we got into like design, stakeholder engagement became one of the threads that one of the, I think it was Guba and Lincoln kind of spoke about that. And then Chalymsky did as well. And so when they came back to that unstructured conversation, they would challenge each other on, well, then how do you really get values identified when you're engaging to really inform the evaluation when you're engaging all these stakeholder groups? Like, how does that work for you as a scholar? So it kind of stayed contained around the concepts. There were moments where they said, well, I could imagine that it would be like this. And that's where that extended abstract was like, oh, they were able to take there's, in fact, one student actually extrapolated for their opposing scholar, knowing what I know about your approach, I could see it being this and this, right? That extended abstract is one of those examples of showing a really deep understanding of the scholar's approaches to evaluation.
I was thinking, just that if it
Yes.
seems like maximum opportunity for cognitive complexity would be to try out a little application. So here's it like to a case and have them say this, what ideas are they bringing and how do they fit together? What needs to be brought out? And let's see,
Yep,
Mike
Mike,
in the,
more.
you want to read that?
Yeah, Mike, maybe we could ask more about how the creative side fits in compared to other ways to use solo. Mike, you want to come on?
I thought that was such a great point, and I'd love to come back to that as well, besides just using it, like you talked about, defining things for your students in your syllabus and your assignments, how about what do you think the creative side contributes compared to other approaches?
I don't think we're understanding what you mean by the creative side.
Well, in this case, you use a role play, which I feel like is something of a creative approach compared to writing a paper or.
Oh, I see what you mean. So that opportunity for students to really own the learning of themselves, right? As they're going, I think Lori was touching on that. And it's something that I've been thinking about, as we're moving, evolving and thinking about what the IDP will look like in 10 years. One of the things that is coming up a lot for me from this experience is definitely case study, case applications. This case competition coming up soon, right? That's an opportunity for students to really challenge themselves. And I think Lori's point about putting cases on the table, I did a little bit of that in our class last semester with needs assessment, cost analysis, synthesis method, where we actually brought a case onto the table and said, here's what we'll be looking at as we think about how to apply all of this learning. And so I think you're right, Lori, is getting cases on the table as part of the learning environment forces them to take the concepts they know and try to apply them in a new way. And I think that really does.
I think, oh, go ahead.
I will say, this is Val. I was in that class, so was John, even though he's not admitting it. Because John doesn't want to share. So I will say that the difference between the case, because I feel like we've actually done a lot of cases. I mean, if I read another case about Kalamazoo Symphony Orchestra, I'd probably throw myself out a window. But I do think that the interesting thing of doing what we did in this class is that it's interactive. Like you don't have any idea what that other group is going to say. And so that keeps you on your toes in a way that something that's static doesn't.
Well, what I meant was to present the group a scenario, basically.
Oh, like,
To have it be a focal point for the
okay,
So that's
to go off and do something by yourself.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting.
yeah.
We could totally take the case and say, as role play, you're gonna describe how you would approach an evaluation of this case from that scholar's position. That's an interesting.
I think the opportunity that presents as well is you can see where some aspects of some approaches or ideas may be, there might be a need to elevate or prioritize those and sort of background some of the others depending on the situation. And I think that can be pretty illuminating. Or how you also realize, I think, these aren't things you just pick one or the other. They're very complementary and aren't really in conflict with each other. It's like what's appropriate for the situation.
Yeah.
Yeah, and for sure, I was kind of getting more towards that interaction and creative in terms of artistic perspective is a fun question. Because that's like I'm trying to spend more time with some of those folks that do artistic and creative, looks at output of evaluation or dissemination or even how to collect data. I think it's really interesting, and I'd love to see them. You'll have to kind of pull them into the next one, see what they have to say.
Lisa?
This is Lisa in the room. One of the things that I'm thinking about is like for myself, when I'm talking about evaluation approaches, one of the things that I'm trying to do with my language is shift away from labeling evaluation approaches as people and as the title of approaches, right? Because I think historically within the profession of evaluation, there have been certain people who are really those like champions for the evaluation approach they have developed, right? And it seems so easy to go to that person and role play that person, right? So I don't know what my question is, but I guess like, I'd love to hear your thoughts on like how this activity might look different if you actually shifted the role playing aspect to just someone who was inhabiting an approach. Because I think that shift may seem small, but I actually think that it opens up the possibility of approaches to a more diverse and inclusive set of perspectives.
So interesting. Sure. So like not Fetterman, but empowerment evaluation.
Because then it opens up like, oh, well, maybe I don't agree with this aspect of this, or like
You're not trying to be a person.
right. And then it invites, so from the student perspective, you're sort of like, well, like, do I want to emphasize this piece or do I want to emphasize that piece? Do I want to Lori's point, couple it with something else?
And I think it acknowledges that like theory-driven evaluation, often is attributed to Peter Rossi, but actually Peter Chen actually has written a ton about it. And so we have people who have built upon approaches, and there's this network of understanding of what it would mean or what it would look like in practice to take a certain evaluation approach.
I like it. Yeah. No, I think that's a really interesting concept that I might play with the next time we do this is think about not the human, but the approach. And that is certainly the way that we've been talking about evaluation theories. And yes, foundation does have its central history of being focused on the people, but it has been less and less of that as I've been moving through it through the last few years of teaching it. Is moving less away from, moving away from the people, but more towards the approaches.
And I'm sure like integrating the activity within your class would really depend on what textbook you use, right? Because if you're using like Shadish, Cook, and Leventon, or you're using the Roots book, like those really center around people. But if you're moving towards like Thomas and Campbell, or a lot of the other textbooks that are centering those approaches rather than the people.
It would be interesting too, because this is a group activity. And so it's almost easier, like, if my group is Peter Rossi and we've all read about Peter Rossi, we all have, this perspective on Peter Rossi. But if you're allowed to come at it from the perspective of different approaches, you can integrate. Well, the way that I might integrate different approaches, or what I might think might be complementary in a particular, setting or case, may be different than my group partner. So then there's this additional like layer of complexity of like, well, what happens with, how do you come to a consensus on integration within a group, which I think often too mimics like the field if you're working with other evaluators, internal, external to a project.
Yeah, so questions.
Yep, two questions. One, I'll get to Mike Moore's question, but I'll mention Jessica Presley's comment. She was also in the class. She said, I think having the bounded works of a particular scholar was helpful for teams to prepare for responses to arguments. So there was something about that, being bounded by the person, the writer, Rossi's writings, Guba and Lincoln's writings was beneficial. which could also be, could occur if we were talking about approaches, right? Mike's saying something more, but how does the profession mature from sometimes belonging to certain people? Is I think the question on the table that Les is getting at as well. And just thinking to myself, Mike says, how does going from imitating an individual to expanding on their concepts fit the taxonomy? That's interesting. So I think, Mike, yes, I think that was part of the process of the students, taking on and being able to, this was the challenge of using the cognitive complexity, the solo taxonomy, the three of us, I think, found most interesting and most challenging was where is when we talk about multi-structure, are we talking about different threads of a particular scholar's writings? Or are we talking about the concepts, the different concepts that they focused on? So it was a challenge to really narrow that down. And we tried to stay within the writer's concepts. And they could talk, like E. Gubin and Lincoln had historically been a little more quantitative and moved to qualitative. And so we kind of talked a little bit, that was more multi-structural, unless they pieced the why they moved and how that impacted their work, then it was more relational. So that's a long-winded response back to your question of imitating. We tried not to do too much. I mean, we let people do what they want. If they wanted to imitate somebody, I did this exercise in my class 2 or so years ago, and one of the people took on Scriven and then acted out the part, and he was Michael Scriven in our debate class. But there was less of that in this, and I wasn't worried about that per se. But expanding on their concepts is what we wanted to see, and that was more multi-structural, interrelational, if they could actually tie the concepts together as to what that meant for the scholar's own evolution. That became more relational. We're almost at the top of the hour.
Yeah. So thank you very much for joining us today. I'd like to acknowledge some important people and individuals who make this semester evaluation very possible. First and foremost, I'd like to acknowledge Laurie Wingate. She's the Executive Director for the Evaluation Center. I also like to acknowledge Brad Wett. He's the Assistant Director. I also like to thank Mary Ramlo. She's our Administrative Assistant, Senior. She's been providing us with pizzas. I also want to acknowledge Lisa and also Kelly. They've been very helpful. Currently, they are the Principal Research Associate here at the Evaluation Center. I also want to give a big thank to Samantha. She's a Marketing Specialist Senior. She's been very supportive with the design of our flyers and sending out invites to our social media platform. And I also like to thank all the staff of the Evaluation Center and all our participants and our distinguished guests, and particularly one of our attendees, Mike. He's been always tuning in every time. So Mike, thank you so much. And we look forward to the fall 2023 Eval Cafe. Thank you.
And thank you, John.
Thank you, Allison. Thank you, Tara. Thank you, everybody, for attending and bringing your questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's nice to be here. Bye.
That was fun. I was just trying to